Good morning, and welcome to day 87 of F260 at First Baptist Meridian. Today we look at 2 Samuel chapter 24 as well as the 24th Psalm, which may have more in common than we catch on first glance. In 2 Samuel 24, where we're going to spend most of our time today, you effectively have the last major episode of David's kingship over Israel. The opening chapters of 1 Kings describe the transfer of power. Solomon is David's successor, but this is his last major chapter as king, and for a lot of people it's an odd chapter. It seems like God stirred David to do the wrong thing, then punished him for it. But if you look at everything going on in context, it makes a lot more sense. David was a humble shepherd boy from the field who acted like a king before he became king, right? This is the kid who went out to do battle with Goliath and said to himself, "The battle is the Lord's." This is the David who recognized when God made him king over all of Israel that God had raised him up and established him even when he didn't have the resources to benefit the people and his calling on their lives. This is the David that had 5 good chapters and he became the king after God's own heart, against whom all other kings were measured. But starting with the Bathsheba incident, David's kingship kind of went downhill. He had tension among his children, he had tension with his children, and the next time David goes out to battle, he's almost killed, ironically, by a giant. So from the kid who kills a giant to the king who is almost killed by a giant. So you see this decline. And perhaps the most tangible expression of this decline is in the beginning of this chapter, which, by the way, you need to read it in context of First Chronicles 21, which says that really God allowed Satan to tempt David. David demonstrates that his reliance is not fully on the Lord, it's on the resources that God has entrusted to him. A good thing has become a God thing. David wants a census of his fighting men because he wants to know his military security and power. But that's kind of the point. This whole time when God was elevating David, David never had the numbers. He never had the resources. He never had something worth counting. He relied on God. And so this military census where he finds 800,000 fighting men in Israel and 500,000 fighting men in Judah effectively is a statement of a lack of faith in a God who provided even when he didn't have those resources at his disposal. And by the way, it's interesting. We let resources, which are a gift from God, often take the place of the God in whom our hope is supposed to reside, right? We're tempted to trust in tangible provisions rather than the God who provides them. So halfway through this passage, David realized he's committed this large blunder, and he's confronted by the prophet Gad, who says, how do you want the Lord to respond to this? With 3 years of famine, with 3 months of running from your enemies — David was no stranger to that by this point — or with 3 days of plague. David says, I will put myself in the Lord's hands rather than those of my enemies. And you have 3 days of plagues, which extracts a massive toll on the people, on the fighting forces of Israel. It's a huge reduction of resources in manpower. But where does the plague stop? It stops right at Jerusalem at the threshing floor of Arana. So David goes to this place to offer sacrifice. And Arana says the king can have it all. He can have the animals. He can have the very land at his disposal. May the Lord your God be with you. But David says, I will not offer to my God sacrifices that cost me nothing. This has been an essential, if difficult, lesson for David in where his help and his hope ultimately resides. From the king who began the chapter waning in his trust with God and relying on resources around him, to the king who at the end of the chapter, despite his losses, puts massive resources into this expression of faith in purchasing the threshing floor. David's sin had extracted a massive toll on his people because sin rarely just affects those who commit the sin. So David buys this place, the threshing floor of Arana, which is where the temple will be built. Interestingly, usually linked very closely with the spot where Abraham had tried to offer Isaac in Genesis 22. 2 key covenantal figures have stories here. But David uses this site and puts massive resources into it as an expression of faith that his reliance is ultimately upon the mercy of God. And that's what's so interesting in the 24th Psalm as we wrap up today. What's the Psalm all about? God as the creator of all things. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, because he made all of it. And then look where it transitions to. Temple language. Who will ascend the Lord's holy mountain? Who will ascend the Lord's mountain, and who will stand in his holy place? That is Eden language. That is temple language. And that's very appropriate in light of the lesson God communicates through David's life in 2 Samuel 24. I'll see you tomorrow. In the meantime, keep reading, keep reflecting, and keep responding to God's word. God bless you.